Morning, everybody. It's good to be here with you on a Monday morning. Today is the 23rd, I believe it is. Um, so we're going to start with chapter 10 today. So if you want to go to chapter 10 notes that I've given you and also get a highlighter out that you can highlight a few things that maybe we talk about that interest you. Um, when we're done with this, you can ask any questions that you want to, and we'll see what the answers are, okay? I don't know everything, and if I don't, I'll try to find out what the answer is for you, but we'll have a fun time talking together. All right? So we're going to start with chapter 10 on page 326. So you can also go to chapter 10 that I have on Google Classroom for you, all the pages. As we're starting with page 326 on section 1. Well, before we do, I'd like to tell you just a little bit of something about George Washington that we've been going through before. He wrote down and copied actually some rules of civility in company, and one of the very first things that he wrote was this, and I'm going to be referring back and forth to my notes here so I can see this. Every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. Some sign of respect at those that are present. So today, I'm dressed up, and not as George Washington, but I'm dressed up as somebody that would be in the Revolutionary War, as a general in George Washington's army. So I'm respecting George Washington today, as we're going to be talking about him. And the things that we say reflect a brilliant man. I mean, this man was loved by everybody in his country, and he did so many things for this country. I don't think we'll ever know everything that he's quite done, but he didn't even know himself the impact that he had. And in what everything that he did, he set a precedence. And that word precedence means an example for all the presidents to come. So we're going to take a look at George Washington a little bit today and his inauguration as President of the United States. Now, as we start reading the very first paragraph on page 326, it says, "Some people expected this occasion to be as elaborate as crowning as a king. George Washington could have been king if he wanted to. He chose not to. Remember what King George III said? If this man refuses to take the kingship, he is one of the greatest men in the world." And he didn't take the kingship, did he? No. He just went back to Mount Vernon and wanted to be a simple farmer again. Simple in his terms. In our terms, somebody that was very, very rich. But George Washington didn't want to be in the highlight. He didn't want to always be the one in the forefront. He wanted to be somebody that was just an average citizen. But the people wouldn't let him, would they? Because we know what happened with the Constitutional Convention. They elected him as to be president of that convention. And now they're electing him to be president of the United States. Before he would go to New York, and that's where they would have the inauguration, he stopped by his mother's house, his mother Mary. And without reading the whole story to you, let me tell you just a little bit of a snippet of what actually happened there. When he went to see his mother, he told his mother that he was elected by the people to be the new president of the United States, something that had never been done before. She realized that was something very, very grand. And he says, you know, when I go to New York and I do everything that they want me to, and I'm inaugurated, then I will come back here and I will see you. And she stopped him right there. Has your mother ever stopped you in the mid-sentence? I mean, just stopped you cold? Well, that's exactly what she did. She says, George, and you will never see me again. He said, how could you say that? She said, because the disease that I have is rapidly taking control of me, and I won't be here by the time you get back next time. Well, what did that mean? She said that he had a calling from God, that God had great things for him. And she says, go, George, with a mother and a Lord's blessing, and do the Lord's work. She would never see him again, because that August of that year, she would die. She would die 1789 of cancer. So George never would get to see his mother again. What a shame. But it just goes to show who was important in his life. His wife, of course, and their kids, and his mother. A mother's blessing. So we get to the inauguration, and it's all set up in New York as if there's going to be a king that's going to be elected. And of course, it's not going to be a king. It's just George Washington. But here's how it goes. He basically had American-made broadcloth brown cut suit, not like this. He wasn't in his general's suit. He was just in a brown cut suit. He had his hair pulled back, tied with a ribbon, and it was powdered. You know, George Washington never wore a wig. Never wore a wig. They powdered his hair to make it white. Standing on a small balcony of Federal Hall in downtown New York City, George Washington took the oath of office on the 30th of April, 1789. Wow. So I want you to do something with me, would you? Would you raise your right hand? And I want you to say this oath with me. This is the oath that George Washington took. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. You just been elected president. No, not really. You have to be at least 35 years old. So, was that it? It wasn't it. It wasn't it. George did something else. Now, he had his right hand up, and they were holding a Bible in front of him, and he had his left hand on the Bible. It was his Bible. He had many Bibles, but this was his own personal Bible. And he bent down and he kissed it. Now, the Bible was open to a very specific page. Imagine if you could have a scripture or part of the Bible open at the very first inauguration of the President of the United States. What verse would you pick? There's many. There's all kinds of verses. Some of them are just very, very appropriate for this time. But do you want to know where it was open to? I'm going to tell you. Not everybody knows. It's not just me. But I'm going to tell you where it was. It was Genesis 49 and 50. So let me get to that spot. I'm going to read it to you. Here we go. Here we go. I'm going to read it right out of the Bible right here. Genesis 49. And it says, verse 26. The blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestors, up to the utmost bound of everlasting hills. Now, I don't know if that's exactly what George was thinking about, but it does talk about blessings. So this whole section here talks about blessings. And in chapter 50, verse 17, this is what I feel that maybe George was thinking about. Verse 17 says this. Thus I shall say to you, Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespass of your brothers and their sins, for they did you evil. No, please forgive the trespasses of the servants of the God of your father. Forgiveness. Talking about forgiveness. So what a way to start off the country, talking about blessings. This country needed blessed. And has this country been blessed? Absolutely has been blessed. And forgiveness. Who was it that George knew had to be forgiven by the people of this new United States? Anybody? The English. The English. How much do you think these people hated the English? Their brothers, their sons, their husbands, their uncles were killed by the British. How could they forgive somebody like this? It had to be done. George also knows in the Bible it says, to be forgiven, you must forgive. And we needed to start clean in this country. So, speculation. Did he really mean that exactly? I don't know. But I do know this. It was open to Genesis 49 and 50, and those are the only two things I can really find out that would be relevant to what George would be thinking about the country. Someday maybe I'll ask him. So, let's get back to this, can we? All right, after he did that, my papers are going all over the place because it's a little bit of windy out here, you can see. The crowds in the streets cheered. Everybody was happy. As the very first president of the United States. And who was the vice president of the United States? Anybody? John Adams. John Adams was the first vice president of the United States. Was that a good pick? George didn't really pick him. He just came in second. But he was a very, very brilliant man. John Adams was a very, very brilliant man. And it was a good pick because John Adams would become the second president of the United States. So, two good presidents to start with. But let's go back to George. He would face a lot of challenges. Um, First things would be this: to establish a new government. Now, I'm not going to try to keep this video too long, 30 minutes tops, I promise. Well, I kind of promise. All right, you know, when I get talking, what happens. So this may end up being part two. Americans and foreigners alike waited to see the actions of what this new country would be. Could it even be anything close to being a country like in Europe? Well, first thing they needed was that Constitution. Now, 1789, was the Constitution totally ratified yet? No, it wasn't. The states hadn't ratified everything because we needed that Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights was finally ratified, and the Constitution was done in 1791. 1791. Was George Washington still president? Of course he was, because he had 4 years as a term. So in his first term, he became president of the United States in 1789. In 1791, now we have a Constitution that's ratified. All 13 states are on board with this, and we can continue to move west to create new states. So these 13 states of the United States will become the basis and the nucleus of this new country. Impressive, really was impressive that they got them all to sign everything. So the Electoral College is what would elect the President of the United States, and we talked about the Electoral College when we were still in school a couple of weeks ago. He would also have to be able to pick his cabinet. Now, every president gets to pick their cabinet, and we talked about this too. When a new president comes in, he can tell the cabinet, thanks for your service, but I have my own people to come in. Or he can keep some people. He doesn't have to tell them all to leave. But there was nobody actually at all. So this is the very first thing. It was a precedence, right? It was an example. So listen to some of the people that are on your notes here. Highlight some of these people, of the ones that actually he picked. He picked Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. Thomas Jefferson. Now, Secretary of State is third in line to be President of the United States. Third in line. So, Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, would be all over the globe. He would be in France. He would be in England. And he's a representative. So, was he a good pick? Absolutely. Jefferson is a brilliant man. And he is well known throughout the world because of the Declaration of Independence, and because of his part that he played in the Revolution, and his writings and the things that he had done. So Jefferson was an excellent pick. Henry Knox. Remember Henry Knox? He was the one with the cannons. Remember the crossing that we watched? And they attacked Trenton? It was Henry Knox that had all those cannons. Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, excellent pick. Died at a young age, though, I think 54 years old. But Henry Knox was somebody that George could go to, the president could talk to, and he could confer in, and he could trust. Okay, so somebody like Henry Knox was somebody that's very trustworthy, and President Washington really trusted Henry Knox. As Secretary of Treasury, most of you know this guy, Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton. Now, you know, President Washington and Hamilton didn't always see eye to eye because of the age difference, maybe. I don't know. But he really did look at Hamilton like his own son. He loved Alexander Hamilton. And Alexander Hamilton was just a brilliant man when it came to finances. Now, he would do some things that other people would question. And he did some things in his life that everybody would question, but don't we all? But Alexander Hamilton would set up this financial treasury that we even have today because of Alexander Hamilton, the way that he did everything with the money. And it was just brilliant. Somebody like Thomas Jefferson didn't really agree with him. We'll get to that later on. But Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of Treasury, very, very good pick. As Attorney General, they would pick Edmund Randolph. Remember Edmund Randolph? Now, he's actually a relative of Thomas Jefferson. But he was the one that had to read the Virginia plan for James Madison, because James Madison maybe a little shy, but he felt that Edmund Randolph, who was governor of Virginia at that time, would do a better job in reading the Virginia plan than he had. So Edmund Randolph would become the new Attorney General, which would be a new position that would be created, actually. Now, let's go back just a little bit before we get to all these men and all the things that they did. When Washington was ready to lead as president, listen to what he says. And if you look on page 327, it'll tell you right here. So unwilling am I to quit this peaceful abode for an ocean of difficulties, without that competency of political skill and the abilities and inclination which are necessary to manage the helm. Washington felt inferior to be president of the United States. He felt that there were other people that could have done a better job than he did. I don't know. His leadership was just something that this country needed, just like we have today. We need that leadership, don't we? And he was somebody that we could look up to and somebody that was very, very well respected. So he took the job. If you notice on that page 327, there's a picture of the Betsy Ross flag. Remember the Betsy Ross flag? Now it's got 13 stars and 13 stripes, I'm sorry. And it does have 13 stars. But they're in a circle. Now we saw that when we watched The Patriot. And that was one thing I told you that was not really accurate. That flag was not invented yet in 1776 or 1777. Really, not until the 1790s. Then why do people carry it? Why do people have it? Story goes that it was Betsy Ross' grandson that spread the story that George Washington asked her to make this specific flag so that they could make some money on her house that's in Philadelphia. True or not, I really don't know. But according to history, that flag was not invented until 1790. So, little glitch in history. Those are the kind of things I like. Histories, mysteries. Now, in this new government, of course, there is going to be 3 branches of government. Whoops, 3. I usually do this way here. 3 branches of government, and we know the first one is the legislative branch, which makes the laws. Okay? So, when they got together, first time was in New York in March of 1789. Before there was a president of the United States, the legislation had gotten together. And as the Constitution required, both houses chose leaders, and members of the House of Representatives chose a speaker, and his name was Frederick Muhlenberg, who was a Lutheran minister from Pennsylvania. So he was the leader. According to the Constitution, though, and the Constitution wasn't done yet. The vice president is the official leader and president of the Senate. Official leader and president of the Senate. So if there was ever a tie, it would be the vice president to break that tie. So the second part is this. The legislation makes the laws and passes bills, and their first act was to pass the Bill of Rights. Now you had to get, they did pass the Bill of Rights, but they had to get the states to actually pass the Bill of Rights. They had to agree by 3/4 of the states. Eventually they got that. And by 1791, and what was the last state to sign that Constitution? That may be the question that I'm going to ask you to tell me. You know what it is. So by 1791, everything was settled. Now, the second branch of this government, of course, is called the executive branch. And the president, cabinet, enforces all the laws. And we just went through the president's cabinet. So there was something else that was very important. Look on page 328, and I'm going down the second column here. So we are following the book just a little bit, and I'm about almost 20 minutes here, so I'm gonna cut this off pretty soon. Article 2 of the Constitution mentions executive departments, but does not name them. In 1789, Congress established the first 3 departments: State, War, and Treasury. Those are the first departments. Now, a few months later, in the Judiciary Act of 1789, that's important. Judiciary Act of 1789, put a star by that, highlight that. Congress created the Office of Attorney General. The Office of Attorney General. That would be the first office that they would actually create. So that would be something new. Edmund Randolph would be the first Attorney General elected to that office. That's the last one that I had told you about. Now, the judicial branch, the third part of this office, interprets the laws. Everything has to be constitutional. The Constitution establishes that only the Supreme Court, as the highest court in the land. So once it goes to the Supreme Court, it's pretty much a done deal. Now, the details of organizing the rest of the court system were left to Congress. So Congress organized the federal court system with the passage of the Judiciary Act of 1789. There it is again. They passed that Judiciary Act of 1789. It stated that the Supreme Court should be made up of one Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. One Chief Justice, 5 Associate Justices. Today's Supreme Court has 9 justices and a Chief Justice, 1 Chief Justice, and 8 Associate Justices. So the Judiciary Act of 1789 also set up a lower federal court, 3 circuit courts, and 13 district courts. Now the Judiciary Act again of 1789. This is a big deal. Judiciary Act of 1789 made clear the Supreme Court's power over state courts. You understand that? Let me read that again. The Judiciary Act of 1789 made clear the Supreme Court's power over all state courts. It gave the Supreme Court the power to rule on decisions of state courts about whether state laws were constitutional or not. That is, if they were contrary to what the Constitution says, the federal Constitution. So you had to realize that some of these states had already written their constitutions. Somebody had to go back and change some things. Now, any state that would come after these 13 states would have to have a constitution. Remember, we talked about that when they were applying for statehood, they would have to have a constitution and it would have to be approved by the government. So when Ohio became the what state? 17th state, we had a constitution that was drawn up, and you had to have 60,000 people to apply for statehood. And it had to be accepted by the government. So once it was, we became the 17th state in the Union. So there's a little Ohio history put in there with the history that we're learning now. So getting back to that first Chief Justice. First Chief Justice would be a man named John Jay. Remember John Jay? He went over there to help Adams and Franklin when they signed the peace treaty over in Paris to end this revolution. So John Jay is very important. Later on, he does something that's very controversial that we'll get to, but very, very smart men. So these men were very smart men. I can't say it enough. That to do things that they did for the very first time and to set a precedence. What does that mean? Example. Precedence means example. So what about this country? We were in debt. We were in debt a lot. Okay, we had debts that we owed other countries. We had debts that we owed people that had given us that they thought were loans, and they end up being donations and not loans. So what are we to do? Can we collect taxes? Well, Alexander Hamilton was in favor of a very strong government, and Thomas Jefferson favored very strong state governments. He didn't want to give up that state power. There has to be a balance somewhere, right in the middle, doesn't there? You can't have a strong government. You can't have a strong state government. You need a middle ground here, okay? So we know the Supreme Court can override courts in the states, but can the government override all state laws? Let's see what Alexander Hamilton has to say about this. And there might be a little bit of trouble between him and Thomas Jefferson. Now, if you look on page 330, there's a picture of Alexander Hamilton. And we're just going to talk about him just for a little bit. I mean, we can look back or go to YouTube or anything to find more out about Alexander Hamilton, but let's take a look at where he's come from. Okay, first of all, Alexander Hamilton came from the West Indies. In 1755, he worked with a trading company in the Caribbean, and his employers were very impressed by his skills and his ambition, and they sent him to a school in New York. Best thing that ever happened to that boy. They sent him to New York. And so as a student, he wrote very fiery pamphlets on independence, and at 22 years old, he joined George Washington's staff. Now, he always wanted to lead, and we saw in those videos that we saw, he always wanted to lead a company or a battalion in battle. Washington knew he wasn't ready yet. So what he was an aide to Washington. He was an aide, and he wrote to Congress many, many, many times about trying to get money for George Washington's troops and food and clothing and whatever else they needed. So in 1782, he became a lawyer in New York, and he was one of New York's delegates in the Continental Congress. And we saw that also. So he did have some money. He did have some money. He did very well for himself. Working hard to ratify the Constitution, he wrote letters to newspapers, as well as essays that were part of, what were those papers called? The Federalist Papers, remember? The Federalist Papers. So he really stood up for the Constitution, didn't he? He was a Federalist. He was a Federalist. So Hamilton had a strong, clear vision of the United States future. And as he tried to build a strong government, he disagreed openly with members of Congress, especially Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State. He really disagreed with Jefferson a lot, because Jefferson wanted that strong state government, and Hamilton wanted that strong federal government. There has to be a middle ground. In any case, as Secretary of Treasury, he developed an economic plan to deal with all the nation's debt. And he would provide a secure base of credit for this country. This country had no credit. Remember what the Dutch always said? Remember what they said to John Adams? Mr. Adams, we tend to give money and loan money to people and nations that will pay it back. We don't know if you'll ever pay it back. You have no credit here. So we need to build up some credit. And we talked about how when you turn 18, you can build up credit of your own, but you have to talk to mom and dad about that. So he wanted to build some credit up for this country. And so here's what he would do. His plan called for the federal government to pay the debts owed by both the nations and the states. So the nation would have to pay their debt, and the states would have to pay their debts to the federal government. They've never done that before. And I don't know if people just really want to give up much of their money. So what's going to happen? Many Southerners had these bonds. Now, you know what a bond is. Some of you might have bonds from Grandma and Grandpa gave you a savings bond. And let's say the savings bond is worth $100, okay? As soon as they give it to you, you can't go and cash it for $100. It takes time for it to mature. So it may take anywhere from 5 to 10 years before that is actually worth $100. Well, a lot of these Southerners had bonds that they had bought to support the war. And according to Hamilton, he would start to buy these bonds back. Now, these bonds really weren't worth much right now because the government was broke. We had no money. So this is where a little bit of treachery came in. And I'm not blaming it on Alexander Hamilton, but there were people in high places that knew that they could probably get their hands on some of these bonds at a very cheap price. Very cheap price. Now, Thomas Jefferson knew about this, and he didn't do this, but he knew it was going on. And what these men did was they went down south, and they purchased a lot of these bonds at less than half the price they were worth. So if you had a bond worth $100, they might give you $35, $40 for it. The Southerners were at least getting some of their money back, some of it. So they thought, well, something's better than nothing. It goes to turn around, and Alexander was trying to pass a law through Congress that these bonds would be worth the total price to whoever had them. So you see, these men had to get these bonds before they passed this law. And a lot of them did. A lot of them spent their entire fortunes spending on these bonds so they could possibly become very, very rich. The law was going to pass, and these Northerners, now a lot of Northerners, were going to get very, very rich because the bonds would be worth the total price that they said they were worth. So they paid $35 for them. Now they're worth $100. Wow, you just made a profit. Imagine if you bought hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these bonds. The Southerners were a little ticked off. I mean, big time when they found this out. So let's see what's going to happen. Before this would be passed, there would have to be some kind of compromise. I told you Thomas Jefferson knew about this, and so did James Madison. And they were both Southerners. Oh, that's right. And there had to be some kind of compromise made. Now, there's probably books on this, and you could really get deep into it, but for our purpose, we don't need to get too deep into it. We just need to know what the deal that was made. And here's the deal that was made. Together in Madison and Jefferson made a compromise with Alexander Hamilton. And the compromise would be this. We'll pass this law. We'll get it passed as long as the nation's capital ends up in the South. Well, Alexander Hamilton didn't like that because they wanted the capital in Philadelphia, maybe even New York. And all the people that supported him lived in those districts, in those towns. How could he go against everything that he knew and let them pick a place? But he did. Does anybody know where the capital of the United States is today? Think about it. It's in a place called Washington, D.C. Is it in the South? Well, that's what Jefferson and Madison wanted. If you put the capital in the South, then we'll pass this bill. What's in the South? So what state is Washington, D.C. in? No state. It's not in any state. Actually, George Washington himself picked out this place. It's in between Maryland and Virginia. It's called D.C., District of Columbia. It's its own entity. It's not a state. It's not a state. So when you go to Washington, D.C., you're not going to Maryland and you're not going to Virginia. You're going to its own territory. They agreed on it. They agreed on it. Now, it was going to take a long time to clear the land and to actually build something there. All through Washington's term and through his second term, there was no Washington, D.C. He had to live in Philadelphia and also in Mount Vernon, of course. The first president that would actually live in what we call the White House today would be John Adams and his wife Abigail. The house wasn't even finished yet. It was a mess. It was a big mud hole there. And everything that they were doing was just one step at a time. So it would take a long time to get to what we have today in Washington, D.C. So we should have really appreciated it. But it was because of Jefferson and Madison that it got put there. So George Washington did pick this place. I don't think he owned it. I don't know. I don't think he did. But it was surveyed. It was picked there for a reason. That it was not quite all the way in the South and not quite all the way in the North, but really it was more in the South than anything else. Maryland, Virginia, that's definitely Southern territory. All right, I'm going to stop for today because I don't want to go very much farther. If I do, you'll stop listening to me. So I want you to look on Google Classroom. I put a couple things on there. I put the website for Mount Vernon that you can go and look up all kinds of things on George Washington. There's a real cool thing on there about his teeth. What kind of teeth did he really have? Wooden teeth, you say? No, not wooden teeth. He had regular teeth. Well, maybe not really regular. You'll see. You take a look at it and see what those teeth were made of and see if you'd put those in your mouth, okay? There's also a couple there's a couple of papers on there that you can look at. There's a couple of things that you'll be able to read, but I do want you to read the rest of chapter 10. Now, I know I'm giving an awful lot of things to do, but when you have time, I want you to go ahead and read the rest of section 1 here. And then if you finish it and you haven't anything else to do, start section 2. I am going to put that movie on there from YouTube on George Washington. It starts with part one, and there are 6 parts. So you have to just keep flipping on to the next part, to the next part, to the next part. There are 6 parts. It really is good. It really is good. You'll learn an awful lot about George Washington. So it's really been nice being with you here today. And I want you to stay safe. And I want you to also share with somebody some good news today. Okay? Because there is good news coming. And I want you to share some good news with somebody today and make them feel good today. All right? All right. Talk to y'all soon. Bye.